When you think of Warwickshire, what comes to mind? Shakespeare's county, Warwick and Kenilworth's mighty castles, or perhaps Coventry's bold skyline, where history and modernity clash in a dramatic fashion. But what if I was to tell you that this historic county was more than just medieval fortresses and towering concrete blocks? Warwick's cities, castles and stories have shaped the very fabric of England's past and continues to shape the very present. From a battle that ended a medieval dynasty to a guildhall whose tapestry holds secrets still yet to be discovered.
Warwickshire certainly holds its fair share of dramatic and intriguing stories, ones that rival anything imagined by its most famous playwright.
So, let's take a step back through time from the Middle Ages to the modern day to explore the secrets etched into this historic landscape.
Along the way, I'll meet with academics, historians and local experts to delve into the stories that helped shape this remarkable county and the legacy they left behind. We'll visit the landmarks that place Warwickshire firmly on the map of England and discover the overlooked stories still hidden in plain sight.
So, join me, Harry McNeill, as we set off across this remarkable county, following these pathways to the past.
Our story starts at the ceremonial centre of Coventry, St Mary's Guildhall.
The foundations of the Guildhall were placed here in 1342, built on the site of a former castle, believed to be Norman, and a former Benedictine monastery. The combination of religious and commercial interests culminated in 1392, with the merging of 4 guilds, including the earlier St Mary's, to form the Guild of the Holy Trinity. But first, what is a guild? And why were they so important to medieval life? I went to speak to Professor Beat Cuman to find out more.
Yes, so guilds are very important institutions in the medieval world. There are both secular and religious guilds. Secular guilds are really organizations that run trades, crafts, so the bakers, the butchers, the fishmongers, for instance, they all have their organizations to agree certain working patterns, to issue some regulations, to, attract all the members that are practicing this trade under their umbrella, as it were. So that's the secular side, and then religiously they're known as fraternities, and they reflect the belief in purgatory, so that you have to make good works in order to secure your salvation. And guilds help people to work towards that goal. So they're usually dedicated to a particular saint. So guilds are really an important aspect of this corporate nature of the Middle Ages. And they needed a place to meet, to assemble, and that's where the guild halls come in.
By the turn of the 15th century, Coventry had grown to become England's 4th largest city, having developed a thriving wool trade which served as a hub for Northern European commerce. English wool was traded as far as the forests of Russia to create simple products like cloth to even ceremonial robes. However, it was wool produced in Flanders that we used to make this.
Created sometime between 1505 and 1515, this tapestry measures 10 feet high by 30 feet wide. The financial backer still remains unknown, although most evidence points towards the monarch at the time, Henry VII.
During this period, Coventry was in serious economic decline. And although there are no recorded costs of the tapestry, it was most certainly expensive. Often incorporating smaller drawings, tapestries like the one here at St Mary's look to create new and elegant constructions, all with the hopes of invoking devotion and commitment among the commoners of the day.
Starting in the middle is the Virgin Mary, namesake of the Guildhall itself, surrounded by the 12 apostles. Above St Mary, the figure of Justice, a later 16th century addition, infamously holding their sword and scales. Alongside this are an array of saints, chief among them John the Baptist and St Catherine. the patron saints of the Trinity Guild. The king and queen depicted are Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. Coventry was especially favoured by the king and queen, who stayed in the city frequently during the 15th century.
But amongst these saints, scholars, and royalty is this man. Seemingly as similar as the rest of the subjects, this figure stands out for the coin in his right hand. Perhaps a gift for the monarch? No. This coin and the supposed snake before it is a symbol of treachery. But who was this man? A disloyal subject? A treacherous advisor? Given the Tudor origins of the tapestry, all evidence points to one man. Richard, Duke of York, a courtier of Henry VI that would become a central figure to a dynastic struggle that would come to be known as the War of the Roses. But returning to our tapestry, what did this all mean for Coventry? I went to talk to a specialist to find out more about its creation and this site's significance. The choice in individuals and saints that are depicted in the tapestry, is that kind of reflective of the sort of aims and ambitions of the patrons or the actual guild itself?
So some saints are very obvious choices. We have St Mary because of St Mary's Hall, and then St Catherine and St John, and then there's St George for England and for battles and warfare. But there are also a few figures that are actually not local to Coventry at all at the time, more for what's now Belgium and the north of France. So there's the patron saint of Paris in there, and another figure. They're on the female saint sides, that's more common in the north of Belgium and the south of the Netherlands, which hints at the more continental French/Belgian origin of the tapestry. So even though wool and cloth was the thing that they traded in here in Coventry and made them very rich and famous, it wasn't actually something that they specialised in. They were more focused on just cloth and plain fabrics.
So standing in front of the tapestry, it's really impressive to look at. Does that sort of size and grandeur, does that sort of speak to the guild's importance in Coventry itself?
I mean, yes, like a tapestry that size would have cost probably millions in today's money. It takes many people many years to make. They estimate, well, probably around 3-5 years at least. I'm not even sure if that includes the whole process of designing and transporting it as well. It is an amazing tapestry. It's not the absolute highest end, nearly. It would have been if it had some gold and silver maybe in there, which so far they haven't found. They did try and change the types of wool and linen and maybe some silk to create some different texture. So they did really try. And still the size of it as well makes it just very, very expensive.
At a time of instability, tapestries like the one here at St Mary's look to send a message to the citizens of Coventry, referring to a golden age of good government with power and authority emanating from the heavens to the king and queen. You would expect pieces like this tapestry to have the power to quell rebellion. You couldn't be further from the truth. Given the often rebellious nature of medieval England, the solution needed to be found to maintain order. That solution was castles.
Continuing on our journey, we travel next to two of the most dominating landmarks of medieval Warwickshire, the fortresses at Kenilworth and Warwick. These castles serve as a timeless reminder of two things. First, the sheer physical presence of medieval rulers, and secondly, the immense political power these rulers held within their castles.
Standing among the ruins of Kenilworth Castle, two questions come to mind. Why are there so many castles in England? And what role did they play in medieval society? We return to Cumin to learn more.
Yeah, I think it sort of reflects the role of the monarchy and the importance of the nobles. So the Middle Ages were really a period where the monarchy was the central institution, and then it relied on a group of people called nobles who were originally the warriors, but then also accumulated like legal and economic kind of functions. They were by birthright the people who were meant to rule, whereas the sort of clergy was meant to pray, and whereas the common people were meant to work and produce the food for the rest of society. So because you had these excelling figures like the the kings and the nobles, you needed to project their kind of power, and one way was architecturally. So these castles would stand out in the landscape. Everybody would have a symbol of lordship right in front of their eyes. They were then also very important for military purposes because they had defensive functions, so they protected the important ruling classes from any kind of aggressions. They also displayed wealth, the fashions of the time. So for the nobles, it was often a case of keeping up with the Joneses, because you need to adapt your castles to any kind of new desires or sort of architectural trends. And then we have bishops also that want to, project their power because they often had secular functions as well as religious functions. So all of these factors combine.
First, let's turn to Kenilworth and explore this castle's embodiment of medieval military might.
Originally constructed as a Norman keep in the 1120s, throughout the 12th century, Kenilworth was consistently renovated. By 1210, under King John, it has certainly accumulated its fair share of notable features, but perhaps most interestingly, its own artificial lake, which would have been where I'm currently standing. After the toing and throwing of the early 13th century, which saw King John lose the castle under the conditions of the 1215 Magna Carta Act, the castle was back in royalist hands by 1244, under the command of this man, Simon de Montfort. With de Montfort, a notable military commander at the helm, you'd expect things to stabilise. However, you'd be wrong. To many people's surprise, de Montfort turned against the king in the early 1260s, forming a bastion of noble rebellion. In 1266, after all this turmoil and strife the castle had already had to endure, Kenilworth was subjected to the longest siege in English history. But what exactly is siege warfare, and how could it cause so much damage to a seemingly impregnable fortress like Kenilworth?
Siege warfare was all about surrounding a town or castle and trying to take it over, either by cutting off supplies and waiting for the people inside to give up, or by launching a full-on offensive. A siege could end in one of three ways. The attackers break in and win, both sides make some sort of deal, or the attackers fail and have to give up. While we often imagine sieges lasting forever, they could actually be quite short. It really depended on the situation. One of the biggest factors in how a siege turned out was morale. In medieval times, that meant having enough food, strong leadership, and the will to hold on. But keeping an army fed wasn't easy either. Getting enough supplies for both soldiers and horses was a constant struggle. On top of that, castles were usually built in tricky spots, on hills or near rivers, which made it hard to completely surround them. And if the defenders were well prepared and organised, they could sometimes hold off a much larger army. Life in the siege camps wasn't great either. Sanitation was poor, and disease, especially things like dysentery, often killed more people than the actual fighting. When the defenders had enough food and could avoid getting sick, the attackers had two options: either give up or introduce heavy siege engines like mangonels and trebuchets. Essentially big machines that hurled stones at the castle walls. Given all these challenges, how did the defenders of Kenilworth in 1266 fare?
The attack began on the 21st of June, with royal forces employing a range of tactics in hopes of penetrating the walls of the castle. On paper, the baronial recruits of 1200 stood no chance against the fresh royalist troops sourced from across the country in hopes of quelling this insurrection once and for all. However, through grit and determination, the rebels were able to hold out until the winter of 1266. Yet, having already survived 6 months, riddled with dysentery and with no external reinforcements in sight, on the 13th of December 1266, the rebels were finally forced to surrender, agreeing to the terms of the Dictum of Kenilworth. Castles were, of course, more than just military necessities. They served an important political function. Next on our journey, we travel to Warwick Castle, to explore its role in the political life of medieval England. Built in 1068 to safeguard against what remained of the rebellious Saxons, Warwick Castle stands as a testament to the political power such fortresses once embodied. In particular, we're here to discuss two families, the Beauchamps and later the Nevilles, whose control of this castle would shape the course of English dynastic history. Beginning with the Beauchamps, who arrived here in 1268. Taking over from the similarly named Beaumonts, this family were not merely provincial notables. They played a crucial role in the governance and warfare of the Kingdom of England.
They were Knights of the Garter, conquerors of the Welsh, commanders of English armies fighting abroad, and Lord Ordainers, to name a few. This family certainly had its fair share of titles.
Perhaps most notable of these lords was the last great Earl of Warwick, Richard Beauchamp, who was essential to Henry V's invasion of France and the consolidation of English territory in Normandy. Richard amassed a personal empire that challenged even the king himself. With this vast wealth, Richard, along with his successors, invested heavily not just into the castle, but also the town of Warwick itself, overseeing the construction of this grand riverfront, as well as Beauchamp's Chapel in St Mary's at Warwick, leaving a lasting architectural legacy. But for all of this, Richard, exhausted from all the battles and conquest that had won him so much, died, leaving a notable family without a unifying figure. The result, a power vacuum, one that would be filled by one of the medieval world's most notable figures, not just a Lord Ordainer, but also a kingmaker. His name was Richard Neville. Originally from County Durham, the Neville family were drawn to Warwick through Richard's wife's inheritance of the title of Countess. A respected military commander, Richard Neville's most notable moments in a historical record were under the service of Henry VI, performing military service in the north and then acting as the captain of Calais. But when the former Lord Protector, Richard, Duke of York, attempted a rising against the king in 1452, the Neville family was dragged into a 30-year-long conflict, one between the houses of York and Lancaster, which would go on to be known as the War of the Roses. Throughout this period, Warwick saw a lot, but perhaps none more important than the summer of 1469, when Richard Neville rebelled against Edward IV.
Though initially an ally of the king, when circumstances changed, the kingmaker seized the opportunity to rebel, capturing and imprisoning the king here at Warwick Castle.
But like the Beauchamps before him, Neville's immense power ultimately led to his own downfall. Killed at the Battle of Barnet in 1471, resolutely fighting against the very monarch he'd helped to the throne.
As we have seen through the stories of Beauchamp and Neville, this castle was home to two of the most powerful figures in medieval England.
It's no surprise then that anyone who owned Warwick Castle was well positioned to influence or even shape the course of history. Over the centuries, Warwick has gradually transformed from a military stronghold to a place of noble residence. Eventually, it's become a symbol of heritage rather than conflict, welcoming tourists rather than knights and kings.
So Warwick Castle became a sort of a genteel sociability hub with nobles like the Earls of Warwick or Lord Brooke, hosting, important celebrities of the period. Canaletto, the famous Venetian painter, took a vista of Warwick Castle when he was over in England. Churchill, I think, had tea there, so there was a kind of culture of the sort of aristocracy with the latest fashions, the latest porcelain, the latest kind of dresses and silk and whatever. So Warwick Castle, I think, allows people who are visiting today to basically get a glimpse of all these different aspects and periods.
Yet, even in their modern form, the walls of this medieval bastion still echo with the political intrigue and military power that once made it one of England's most significant strongholds.
But the conflict that consumed the medieval imagination, the War of the Roses, a conflict which tore apart families, towns and dynasties, would not be decided within the walls of Warwick or Kenilworth. Instead, it was to be decided here, at Bosworth, a field that on a hot and humid August day in 1485 would hammer the final nail in the Yorkist coffin. On the 7th of August, 1485, the future king, Henry Tudor, landed on the Pembrokeshire coast with a host of 5,000 European veterans. His claim to the English throne was through his mother, Margaret Beaufort.
Marching along the Welsh coast before veering towards Shrewsbury, then moving south to Bosworth, Henry's forces reached the battlefield on the 22nd of August.
Whilst the Royalists, under the command of Richard III, had an army of over 9,000 men to Henry's 5,000, the loyalty of these men was indeed very questionable, particularly under the Earl of Northumberland or Henry Percy. As such, victory for the Royalists was far from guaranteed. Stood here at the top of the hill was the vanguard of the Royalist army, under the command of the Earl of Norfolk, John Howard. To the south stood the Tudor army, with its vanguard under the command of the Earl of Oxford, John de Vere.
Separate to both the Royalist and rebel forces were the 6,000 men under the notable Stanley brothers, Lord Thomas and Sir William. Like vultures circling carrion, these men were hedging their bets, waiting for an obvious opportunity to sway the battle. The Stanleys had been courted by both sides, but their loyalties remained vague. The night prior to the battle, Richard, despite his favourable position, was reportedly plagued with nightmares, one of which was most vividly described in Shakespeare's eponymous play.
Me, thought the souls of all that I had murdered, came to my tent, and everyone did fret tomorrow's vengeance on the head of Richard.
The battle commenced with the Oxford's rebel vanguard advancing on to the Royalist forces, with their right flank protected by marshland. Norfolk, seeing this advance, ordered his men to meet them. Oxford looked to punch a hole through the Royalist front line, but reinforcements bolstered Norfolk's men and the armies were forced to separate. Once again, Oxford tried, and this time with more success, killing Norfolk in the process.
Seeing his troops wavering, Richard looked to the Earl of Northumberland to intervene. However, this call for help fell upon deaf ears. Whether this was treachery or purely an inability to traverse around the marsh, historians remain unsure. Realising the battle was at its climax and decisive action was needed, Richard looked to cut the head off the Welsh dragon.
At this point, Richard had sent 3 messengers to Lord Stanley, frustratedly demanding to send his men into the fight or for him to watch his son die. After 15 anxious minutes, Richard got his response. "Tell Richard I have other sons." With his companions either dead or deserting, contrary to popular belief, Richard remained steadfast. Like a man possessed with anger and rage, he thrust his lance into Sir William Brandon, Henry's standard bearer. The man was dead before he'd hit the ground.
Riding on, now Richard faced Sir John Chain, Henry's personal bodyguard. Chain was a juggernaut and renowned jousting champion. Fearless, Richard unhorsed the giant, using just the broken stub of his lance. The problem for Richard now was a trick Henry had up his sleeve. Henry's army consisted of more than just English and Welshmen. He had French allies with men specialised in anti-cavalry tactics. Men with pikes surrounded Henry in a hedgehog formation. Already engaged with Henry's formation, it was too late for Richard and his knights on horseback. Then it happened. Richard's horse was wounded. In pain, the horse reared up and threw Richard to the ground. The king was down. Rising from the battlefield, Richard professed, "God forbid that I retreat one step. I will either win the battle a king or die as one."
Surrounded, Richard was undeterred, engaging with several attackers on his own, something which witnesses described as his greatest moment. Seeing that Henry's flank was crumbling, Lord Stanley decided to cut off Richard's attack. Now, Richard was surrounded by Stanley's men, yet he pushed on, within a sword stroke of Henry himself. However, without any companions, Richard was alone. The last moments of Richard are well documented, although disputed. The historian Marilee Hanson writes that he was wounded multiple times, but continually refused advice from his companions to flee or to take a horse. His heroism was evident to all, but in the end, Richard could not prevail. His crown was knocked from his head, and his skull was struck so many times that the metal helmet was beaten into it. Even in death, his body was savagely attacked. There is a legend that the crown landed in a hawthorn bush. True or not, it was soon enough in the hands of Henry Tudor, but not because of any personal bravery on the part of the first Tudor king. With the death of Richard, among 400 others, Lord Stanley placed the crown on his stepson's head. In those 2 hours, Warwickshire had witnessed the death and betrayal of one king and the beginning of one of England's most celebrated dynasties. As Hanson writes, Henry may have claimed a crown, but he had earned no glory. Bosworth marked the end of the Middle Ages, and with the new dynasty came an array of social-cultural change. With the end of the War of the Roses, English society had certainly seen its fair share of turbulence. Now, with the Tudors on the throne, opportunities arose for individuals to change the very social fabric of society. With a new dynasty, maps were redrawn and buildings were updated, and in Warwick, we find a testament to this great change: the Lord Leicester Hospital. A recorded gift from the Warwickshire Burgesses. In 1571, the Lord Leicester fell into the hands of Lord Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. A favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, Dudley's acquiring of this building seems to be a legitimate and fair one. But of course, with the often manipulative behaviour of Tudor courtiers, other sources say otherwise. I went to talk to Angus Crawford to find out more about this treasure trove of Warwickshire history. Why was Dudley so important? Why did they really need to give such a lovely building to him?
No, yeah, that's absolutely right. Robert Dudley bullied the Corporation of Warwick, as you said, the Burgesses. It wasn't so much as a generous gift on their part. Our major source for this is the Black Book of Warwick, which is the second source we have of the history of the Corporation of Warwick in this period, which is like the government of Warwick. And essentially, they failed to meet Robert Dudley as he was entering into the town, and he used this in his negotiations with the Burgesses to get an almshouse for free. And this was important to Robert Dudley for a few different reasons. I think, first of all, Robert Dudley, although he was very wealthy, he also racked up huge debt. He had limited disposable income. The fact that he would have had this almshouse for free was quite a statement. And also, the fact that it was the building of the Warwick Burgesses is also significant because it was their meeting house. It was the most important building in the town of Warwick. The fact that, as we mentioned, the almshouse was founded in 1571, but these buildings date back to the 14th century or so. So he was adopting buildings which already had an established sense of history.
Facing a backdrop of years of conflict on the continent, many returned to England with life-changing injuries. Despite this, few places could accommodate this influx in veterans. However, under Lord Dudley, the Lord Leicester would become one of these few centres of care. For an institution like the Lord Leicester, with many arriving and becoming brethren, those in charge looked to find a way to keep everything in order. Robert Dudley's 34 rules, many of which are still in use today, set out a code of practice for life within the hospital.
Here are some of the most important of these rules.
Number 1. The master shall be an ordinary preacher of God's word. Number 9. If there are no poor soldiers to be brethren, sick or unfortunate persons are to be preferred. Number 24. No one earning over £5 a year will be permitted to become a member of the Brethren.
Although these rules ensured the Brethren lived a life of seeming tranquility and benevolence, life at the Lord Leicester was far from a 5-star luxury experience.
Number 18. Brethren must wear their robes when entering town. Number 19. No member may leave the town without permission of the master. Number 25. No member may marry without the permission of the master.
As we've seen, life at the Lord Leicester was certainly unique. But what was it about English society that facilitated this philanthropic endeavour? To discuss this more, I went to talk to historian at the University of Warwick, Dr. Naomi Pullen.
So in that sense, it's quite unusual that it doesn't really have like a big focal point. And actually the county itself is quite divided in a way that, again, it isn't necessarily typical, certainly in the early modern period. And it's partly to do with how it is set up kind of religiously, how its boundaries are defined as dioceses, that it's got two quite distinct jurisdictions. It's got the diocese of Coventry and Lichfield, reflecting the north, and the diocese of Worcester in the south, but it actually doesn't have its own diocese within its county, which actually has meant that I think Warwickshire is quite unusual in that it can be quite outward looking, and that's something that Anne Hughes talks about quite a lot in relation to kind of the key gentry and noble and elite figures, particularly in the early modern period, that you have some kind of great names, but they themselves are often have interests elsewhere in the country.
Institutions like the Lord Leicester weren't just responses to need. They were reflections of a changing England. Warwick and men like Robert Dudley stood at the crossroads between tradition and transformation. As the Tudor state looked to impose order on a fractured kingdom, almshouses like this reveal how philanthropy, politics and power became deeply intertwined. In Warwickshire, we see how local met the national, how one building can reveal the ambitions of a dynasty and the realities of a society healing from war.
Despite centuries of social and economic change, the Lord Leicester has continued its function to this day, albeit with a museum and visitor experience attached. The hospital continues to house brethren, a master, and hundreds of stories embedded into the walls of this great institution. Continuing on our journey, we travel to Leamington Spa, a Victorian spa town built in the 19th century either side of the River Lem, to learn more about a man whose, let's just say, unique behaviour certainly wouldn't have been welcome at the Lord Leicester.
The unique gentleman who lived within this very house was Alister Crowley, the infamous early 20th century eccentric and occultist whose story is certainly a strange one.
On the 12th of October, 1875, Edward Alexander Crowley was born to a devoutly Christian family. His father, also called Edward Alexander, was a religious zealot and a preacher for the Puritan Plymouth Brethren. Despite this strict Christian upbringing, while at Trinity College, Cambridge, Crowley certainly enjoyed his fair share of activities like poetry. However, it was his exploration into paganism that would take him on a path not even his father could have expected. After a couple of fallouts with other mystic organisations, Crowley decided to take the initiative and create his own religion, Thelema. But what exactly is Thelema?
At the core of Thelema is a simple message. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Now, this doesn't mean pure hedonism. It means that everyone has their own will or true will that they have to align themselves to in order to reach pure happiness. This pursuit of happiness, for many, I'm sure, would entail a walk in the park, or maybe reading your favourite book. But for this Leamington local, it was sex magic. Sex magic refers to the use of sexual energy as a ritual tool in which to achieve magical or spiritual goals. Crowley believed that through sexual acts, one could direct their willpower. They could alter their level of consciousness and even invoke supernatural or spiritual forces. Crowley saw sexual energy as the most potent form of life force. believing that through ritual concentration and symbolism, it could be directed to achieve personal transformation or magical outcomes. For Crowley, sex was rich in alchemical and mystical symbolism, representing the union of opposites, be that masculine and feminine, passive and active, and even solar and lunar. Now having found the golden ticket to eternal satisfaction, Crowley looked to establish his own cult, which was centred on the island of Cefalù off the Sicilian coast. He called it the Abbey of Thelema. On this island, Crowley's community explored every desire that could be gratified, every impulse that could be expressed, all through concoction of sex, drugs, and physical excess. However, for Italy's leader at the time, one Benito Mussolini, this all went too far, and in 1923, Crowley was evicted from his island. Alister Crowley remains one of Leamington Spa's most notorious figures, a man that walked sharply against the grain of Victorian respectability and religious convention. His story, though chaotic and controversial, offers a fascinating glimpse into a world where spiritual searching meets personal excess. From strict Christian beginnings to ritual magic on a Sicilian island, Crowley's story challenges our understanding of belief, identity, the lengths one will go in pursuit of their true will. In a town structured by Victorian order, his legacy reminds us that even the most structured societies produce their rebels. As Crowley was reaching his final years, he continued his lifestyle, spending all of his money and leeching off of others, dying at the age of 70, penniless. At the end of his life, the world was hurtling towards a new kind of chaos, one that Crowley himself would never have imagined.
On the 14th November 1940, it became a city of destruction.
During the Second World War, the German Luftwaffe's bombing campaign targeted British cities that were key to the Allied war effort. As a major site of industrial production, Coventry sat towards the top of this list. On the evening of the 14th of November 1940, Coventry was bombarded with air raids.
The city was obliterated. After one night of bombing, only a third of Coventry was left standing. For all of this damage and destruction, Britain was left with a near insurmountable task, the rebuilding of its industrial heartlands. In Coventry, this responsibility was left with the city's first planning officer, Sir Donald Gibson. His novel and revolutionary solution was concrete. This solution was part of a movement we now call brutalism. But what was brutalism? I went to talk to Dr. Jack Bowman to find out more about this architectural phenomenon.
So brutalism is kind of architectural movement, but also I think, political statement. A very kind of post-war influenced, grew largely out of modernist styles, Bauhaus, this kind of stuff. And yeah, I think it's kind of notorious today for being ugly and brutal, but brutalism comes from, or is allegedly come from the French Breton brut for concrete. So, and it is these kind of hulking concrete structures, but very focused on, forms of living, socialist attitudes to how people go about their days, not just big hulking overbearing structures.
So how would you say the events of World War II kind of influenced the movement?
Well, in a number of ways, and I think most interestingly in Coventry at least, which became at least a kind of loose global capital for brutalism, this was really born out of necessity more than anything else.
The historian Alexander Clement divides Coventry's brutalist experiment into three distinct sections. The first, from 1945 to 1960, was the post-war international style, as you can see with the Belgrade Theatre behind me. Then there was the second and much wetter stage, or the massive style, from 1960 to 1975. And the third and final stage, or the transitional stage, from 1975 to 1985. But perhaps most memorable of these stages was the first, commemorated by the construction of this, Coventry's new and improved cathedral. Left with nothing but the ruins of the old medieval St. Michael's, a building which had stood for over 600 years. A competition was put out in 1950 for proposals for a new cathedral. After sifting through over 200 submissions, a winner was chosen. His name was Basil Spence. Spence's design was praised for its incorporation of the old cathedral, something lacking in the designs of his competitors. Incorporating not just concrete, thus perhaps saving it from the label of brutalist, The cathedral also included sandstone and glass. Essentially, Spencer's Cathedral was a basilica form with two circular side chapels. Unity and industry. As Clement notes, this building was important not just to Coventry, but to Britain as a whole. It symbolised the regeneration of a society scarred by war, the rebuilding of Britain's towns and cities with the rubble of the Blitz, the revival of the nation's church and faith, and in no small way, the reinvigoration of the country's architectural profession.
It's very interesting what Gibson did right from the very start of the department in 1939 was work with the local press to publicise anything that the department was doing, but also work by taking groups and counsellors to local schools, local civic groups to talk about the department. So people had an idea of what they wanted to do. And then, of course, when the Blitz came, and just prior to that, in the May of 1940, the department had put on a big exhibition, lots of really good design, architecture, plans that they wanted to make. So people knew what was coming. And the comments to that exhibition are in the main, and it was a very big turnout. I think they had over 5,000 visitors. The comments are overwhelmingly positive. You know, if this gets built, it will be wonderful. Coventry will be proud if this happens, that kind of comment. Some said it's going to cost too much and it's a bit pie in the sky. But generally, although it wasn't built at that time, that was, it was a very positive reaction. I think when it went up, I think people were simply glad to see something actually happening.
So talking about the cathedral in its broader context post-war, as you're saying, it's a sort of revival of faith, but does it symbolise more than that, the rebuilding of a society more generally?
Yes, it has huge symbolic value, I think. In itself, what Spence wanted was a pilgrimage. So you go from death and destruction in the ruins through to eventually you're at the altar looking at Christ in the tapestry. And that symbolism of moving from destruction to something more positive is huge, I think. It's as a centre of reconstruction, it has contacts all around the world. And I think its role as an emissary of peace and talking is hugely important.
What was built here was not just a place of worship. It was a monument to resilience. A bold architectural statement that Coventry would not just survive, but thrive. Coventry Cathedral not only stands out as a piece of architectural innovation, but it also represents a deeply human response to tragedy. One that looks forwards, not back.
Through war, rubble and rebuilding, Coventry reinvented itself. It's a story not just of bricks and mortar, but of identity, memory, and the power of design to shape the spirit of a city.
So brutalism is about creating communities, creating, ideas of utopianism, that what we get is a real sense of everyone coming together, whether that's in construction of blocks of flats where there's communal spaces in the middle, or sports centres. In Coventry, we've got like the Elephant Building, right? 5-6 floors of community-centred sport. This is very much a political project as well as just, this is what we have to do because everything's been blitzed.
Across this journey, we've uncovered the richness of Warwickshire. From the majesty of the Guildhall in Coventry, the trials and tribulations at Kenilworth and Warwick Castle, to the bloodshed at Bosworth, and the mystic legacy of Alister Crowley.
Warwickshire has seen a wealth of history, tragedy, and transformation over the centuries. But it is also a place of rebirth, a place where new buildings rise out of old ones, a place where new communities surge forward from the wreckages of war. To condense this into one story is no easy task. Perhaps the words of the late 18th century playwright David Garrick best encapsulates the spirit of this county.
Be proud of the charms of your county, where nature has lavished her bounty, where much she has given, and some to be spared, for the bard of all bards was a Warwickshire bard. Never paired, for the bard of all bards was a Warwickshire bard. Each shire has its different pleasures, each shire has its different treasures, but to rare Warwickshire all must submit, for the wit of all wits was a Warwickshire wit. How he writ, for the wit of all wits was a Warwickshire wit.